Hello and good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to this lunchtime talk presentation, summer school. And I think you are in for quite a treat this afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce our lecturer this afternoon, Max Dupree. Max Dupree is no stranger to the University of Cape Town. Some of you may have attended, I think, 2 or 3 years back when he gave the Dumini Freedom Lecture, which was also very well attended. And the attendance today, again, just shows the respect that Max commands. So most of you know Max as a writer, columnist, documentary filmmaker. And during the very dark apartheid days, he also founded the Vrye Weekblad, which I'm sure many of you read, an Afrikaans language weekly, which was very bold and exposed quite a lot of what was happening in the country at the time. And for his reporting, Max has won the Nat Nakasi Award. Max has also been a political correspondent for many other publications, including The Beeld, Financial Mail, Sunday Times, Business Day. In fact, there's a column, those of you would have seen today, I think, by Max on the dilemma faced by Cyril Ramaphosa and the tenuous and difficult relationship with Jacob Zuma. It's worth reading. I know Max from the time that he produced Special Assignment, and the focus that Special Assignment had then on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was really the marquee program on what was happening during the lifespan of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for which Max has also received many, many accolades. Max is that proverbial canary in the coal mine, giving advanced warning of some danger. He is never afraid to sound the alarm, even if it means drawing the ire of powerful and very influential forces. Today, Max will treat us on a lecture on the role of civil society in the perilous and challenging times that our country is going through. We all know and deeply appreciate the role that civil society played in the struggle for democracy, how it was able to withstand the might of the apartheid state and keep hope alive when political organizations were banned and forced underground. What then is the role of civil society now in a democratic dispensation when political parties are free to operate and when there is freedom of association? So let's sit back then for what I'm sure will be not only fascinating but also thought-provoking on civil society's pushback, the pendulum swing of South Africa. Max Dupree.
Very good. Took my notes. Good afternoon. Thank you, Russell. I'm the canary. Let me just first say it is lovely to speak to such a youthful audience. Young people are the future, I say. Canary. I was young once. 28 years ago, I stood on this campus when the University of Cape Town decided to award me an honorary degree for all the trouble I was making. And I remember I spoke at this graduation ceremony, and I went into a tirade against big capital. And it was a long time ago. I might even have used the words white monopoly capital, which was kind of okay. I was young and times were rough. The only problem was the chancellor who gave me my degree was one Harry Oppenheimer, the king of big capital then. I've been a close observer of the South African political and social scene over the last 3 decades and more. So few things shock or surprise me. But I must say I was shocked last week by the extraordinary hero worship by the ANC in KwaZulu-Natal of former President Jacob Zuma, and by the comradely warmth with which he was treated by Cyril Ramaphosa. I know, and I wrote about this in my column this morning, that we are witnessing a fake bromance for the sake of party unity before the election, but I think Ramaphosa was completely over the top. In my column this morning, I call this bromance a third-rate soap opera with a bad script and terrible actors. I think the whole episode at the ANC's birthday celebrations in KwaZulu-Natal last week makes one wonder whether South Africans truly understand the catastrophic damage done to our society and our economy by the 9 years of the Zuma presidency. If only 10% of the allegations against him and his inner circle are true, Jacob Zuma belongs in jail, not on the ANC's election list or as a member of the proposed Council of Elders. It would be a bad advertisement for old people. I believe history will one day reveal how close South Africa came to becoming a Zaire under Mobutu Sese Seko. That's where we were headed. We're only beginning to now comprehend the absolute destruction Zuma had left in his wake in terms of the economy, but also, almost more importantly, in terms of our political environment. There's now more tolerance, more intolerance, more cheap populism, more division, more hatred, more inequality, and more poverty, and more instability than a decade ago. The Zuma administration seriously damaged many of our state institutions, compromised and paralyzed our criminal justice system, sold large chunks of the state to state capturers and other Zuma benefactors, undermined the rule of law, and virtually ended all political accountability. And with the help of the British company Bell Pottinger and the Gupta media, ANN7 and the newspaper, it tore the people of South Africa apart and exploited our historical problems and our fault lines in our society purely in order to conceal their theft and corruption. Cheap populism and ethnic chauvinism invaded our body politic. In the eyes of the international community, South Africa became yet another corrupt, incapable African state, and foreign investment plummeted. I think the fact that South Africa is vaguely in one piece after such an assault is testimony to this country's inherent resilience. It is quite remarkable. I have been a journalist for more than 30 years, and every now and again I just say to myself, we're like a well-built nuclear reactor. When the whole thing overheats, the fuel rods just automatically cool down. That's what we are. Zuma brought us very close to that meltdown. And now we have to start the difficult crawling back from the abyss. We don't only have to repair the damage of the last decade, we have to make up for lost time, because expectations of the people didn't stop. It grew. South Africa could have been a very different place now if it hadn't been for the destructive Zuma tsunami, as it was called. Praveen Gordon estimates that around 100 billion rand was stolen from the state just over the last few years. Add to that the around 720 million that Eskom and other state-owned enterprises lost during this time. It is massive in an economy like ours. But Zuma's reign did come to an end a year ago. Cyril Ramaphosa is now in charge. The Guptas are fugitives of justice outside the country. Political accountability is back on the table. The criminal justice system is being restored, slowly, but it is. The cleanup and rebuilding of our state-owned enterprises are in process, and the Zondo Commission is meticulously uncovering the machinations of state capture. The story of how a modern democracy was captured by criminally minded business people and politicians was a very dramatic one that people all over the world had taken note of. But the pushback was even more dramatic. Not many countries caught in a vicious downward spiral like ours, like we were, succeed in breaking free and restoring the rule of law and public accountability. The Ramaphosa camp of the ANC would love to take credit for this, as would the opposition parties. In my book, they can take very little credit. Virtually all the credit should go to the civil society organizations, and by that I include the media. Of course, they all had the massive advantage of being able to use a splendid constitution as a weapon, and we should all be deeply grateful that our independent judiciary has survived the Zuma onslaught in one piece. Something that doesn't always happen in countries in crisis, like Zimbabwe, like Venezuela, and many other examples. If it hadn't been for civil society activism, I would argue Jacob Zuma's preferred candidate would have won the 2017 ANC election, and we would today have looked a lot more like Venezuela or Zimbabwe. The Guptas would still be here. We would have signed a 1 trillion rand nuclear deal with Russia. Treasury would have been captured by now. We would have been downgraded to absolute junk status by everybody. But almost against its own basic instincts, the ANC National Conference chose Ramaphosa, because the stink of state capture, enrichment and corruption had become just too much, even for the ANC insiders. South Africa's negotiated settlement of 1994, our peaceful transition and the way we practiced restorative justice through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission are internationally celebrated examples of how nations should deal with conflict. I believe the role of civil society and the return to normality after 9 years of Jacob Zuma and his madness will be too. Of course, if civil society were out of step, out of sync with the people of the country, it wouldn't have worked. But we saw the trade unions taking to the streets. We had dozens and dozens of mass marches that civil society organizations, their appeal to the people were heard, and the people responded. We are at an esteemed academic institution, so perhaps I should try to sound vaguely intellectual and define what civil society is before we get stuck in our conversation. All the members of a society, all the people living in this country, are members of civil society. For the purposes of my talk today, I will be focusing on organized civil society, bodies and groups outside government and the market. A definition that is widely accepted states that civil society is, quote, the wide array of non-governmental and not-for-profit organizations that have a presence in public life expressing the interests and values of their members or others based on ethical, cultural, political, scientific, religious, or philanthropic considerations. Civil society organizations therefore refer to a wide array of organizations: community groups, non-governmental organizations, labor unions, indigenous groups, charitable organizations, faith-based organizations, professional associations, and foundations, unquote. And as I said earlier, we have to, in our society, and I think in most societies, include the media in that definition. Most of these civil society organizations that I am going to be talking about were formed after 2010, after Jacob Zuma became president, and it happened in reaction to his administration and their behavior. But these new organizations, these new NGOs, these civil society organizations, had a template from the post-1994 era to work with: the Treatment Action Campaign, the gold standard of civil activism. Treatment Action Campaign was founded in 1998 during the Thabo Mbeki HIV/AIDS madness to campaign for access to HIV/AIDS treatment. Its first big victory came when the Constitutional Court ordered the government to provide antiretroviral drugs to prevent HIV transmission from mothers to their babies during birth. It can also take credit for Parliament's adoption of the National Strategic Plan on HIV, STIs, and TB in 2007. And now this program is the biggest in the world. The Treatment Action Campaign was a magnificent machine of activism led by street-smart and committed activists who did a whole lot more than just go to court. The founding director of UNAIDS, a guy with the name of Dr. Peter Piot, quite rightly called the Treatment Action Campaign the smartest activist group of all worldwide. So, in my heart, the Treatment Action Campaign, Zaki and his friends are among my big heroes in this country. The ANC government, you'll remember, was hostile towards the Treatment Action Campaign. Thabo Mbeki and several other senior ANC leaders regularly labeled it and defamed them and did their best to delegitimize it. We heard the old story that we've heard since, aimed at non-governmental organizations, that they were funded by some foreign force, that they had to undermine our democracy. Well, they said that about the Treatment Action Campaign. Let me interrupt myself here with another thought. The ANC in exile did not live in open societies, mostly in Umkhonto-we-Sizwe bases in neighboring states, or in offices in Luanda, Lusaka, or in countries of the former Soviet Union. It developed a very strong hegemonic political culture. The ANC was called, after all, and saw themselves as the sole and authentic representative of the people of South Africa. There was very little tolerance of dissenting voices, to put it mildly. Talking about before 1990. After 1994, ANC leaders often countered dissenting views, even coming from the High Court judges, with the argument that the ANC had won the elections and no one else had a mandate to speak on behalf of the people. But the political culture of the internal resistance in the 1980s, the United Democratic Front, was very, very different. It was itself made up of literally hundreds of diverse civic, labor, student, and religious organizations. It had a culture of non-racialism that was practiced every day. It had a culture of tolerance of divergent views and of a consultative democratic process that was the antithesis of democratic centralism. It was a tragic day, in my humble opinion, and I think this needs to be written about more, researched more. It was a tragic day when the ANC swallowed up the UDF in 1990 and spat out all its political sensibilities. If some of the UDF's political culture had remained, the Zuma phenomenon would not have been possible. So the UDF, and not the ANC, was the spiritual parent and training ground for the post-apartheid civil society activists. Go through the more well-known names of activists, and you'll all trace them back to, they were UDF activists. So, less than a year after Jacob Zuma became president, the NGO Section 27 was formed, named after Section 27 of the Constitution, that commits to the realization of socio-economic rights, including health care, sufficient food and water, and social security. That's in our Bill of Rights, Section 27. Now, the NGO Section 27 has become a highly effective public interest law center that uses law, advocacy, legal literacy, research, and community mobilization to achieve access to healthcare services and basic education. You all must remember how Section 27 mobilized people around the non-arrival of school books over the last number of years. What they're doing is absolutely crucial work. Our 1996 Constitution doesn't just declare an end to apartheid and didn't just give everybody the vote. It declares in its founding provisions that the new state is founded on the values of, quote, human dignity, the achievement of equality, and the advancement of human rights and freedoms, non-racialism and non-sexism, and supremacy of the Constitution and the rule of law. In the Bill of Rights, the Constitution commands the right to free basic education, access to decent housing, and children's right to basic nutrition, shelter, basic healthcare services, and social services. That's important, because it didn't happen. It didn't happen. Our task as a people is to turn around centuries of colonialism and apartheid and to create a more equal society where everybody has equal opportunities and is enabled to live to his or her full potential. We need energetic activists to constantly remind those in power and in money of this. NGOs like Women on Farms, the Shack Dweller movement, Abahlali Basim Jondolo, the Black Sash, we all remember very, very fondly. I have the highest regard for the work that the Black Sash had done. They do also do some of this work, but more needs to be done because we are facing a lot of anger in our communities at the moment because the dreams of a better life had not materialized. We spent our money on arms. We spent our money, our state money, on buying friends in India and elsewhere. We waste it and we steal it, and we should have spent it on the people. So the Zuma ANC paid lip service to all these great values of the Constitution and even upped the ante with its Bell Pottinger-inspired slogans of radical economic transformation, white monopoly capital, and expropriation without compensation. But they only shouted these slogans to cover up their corruption, abuse, and the theft of billions that could have been spent on development, that should have been spent on development. Only the wealthiest capitalists, the politically connected, and the corrupt benefited from the Zuma era. Most of us lost. The poor the most. The ANC's instincts to keep information from the public, an old anti-intellectual bent in the ANC that we've seen coming to the fore again under Jacob Zuma. It introduced the Draconian Protection of State Security Bill in 2008, the secrecy bill, remember? That would have made it virtually impossible for the media to report on state corruption. If that bill had passed then, we would know nothing of state capture. So this led to the formation of the Right to Know campaign in 2010 that fought this tooth and nail, mobilizing activists countrywide in a very short period of time. And I think the Right to Know campaign continues to fight very effectively for a free flow of information. That was the beginning, first signs of a pushback. But let's get to the meat of the dramatic civil society actions that countered state capture and brought an end to the Zuma era. I think we need to acknowledge civil society organizations like the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution and Freedom Under Law, both movements formed by prominent progressive legal minds that aim to protect the Constitution, the rule of law, and the freedom of the judiciary. With civil society organizations such as Corruption Watch, which was a COSATU initiative, and bodies like the liberal Helen Suzman Foundation, they have lobbied and litigated to expose and stop corruption and state capture. The trade unions played a big role, COSATU mainly then, in taking to the streets and putting up pressure inside the tripartite alliance. But the central role was played by a handful of investigative journalists and a few very brave whistleblowers. I'm back to my point about the UDF days. Apart from investigations into the information scandal in the late 1970s, the mainstream media didn't do much serious investigation during the last decade or so of apartheid. It was reporting on events. It had perhaps critical editorial writing, but it abandoned serious investigative journalism. Apart from newspapers that were broadly aligned to the UDF, the Weekly Mail, now Mail and Guardian, the Weekly Mail, Vrye Weekblad, a New Nation, run by Zolaki Sisulu, the so-called alternative newspapers of the 1980s and early 1990s. These newspapers, at great risk to themselves, exposed the apartheid police and military's death squads and kidnapping and torture and assault and murder. Well, during the last 8 years, my colleagues in the mainstream have been catching up. Not that all investigative journalists and so-called whistleblowers are covered in glory. In one of the most shameful chapters of our media history since 1994, 3 investigative reporters at the Sunday Times swallowed false information on a special investigative unit at SARS, planted on them by state agents, and they dubbed it the rogue unit. Rogue unit, when I talk about SARS investigations unit, nobody knows what I'm talking about. The minute I say rogue unit, you suddenly realize what I'm talking about. It was never a rogue unit. The Sunday Times called it a rogue unit, and then it became a rogue unit. It was a magnificent team of investigators who investigated serious tax evaders and corruption. So despite protestations from those accused of wrongdoing, the people in this unit, and by those who had appointed them and sanctioned them, the paper published one damning story after the other over a course of many, many weeks. Some of the reports were absolutely fantastical, like the allegation that the unit ran a brothel and that they had secretly spied on President Zuma. These reports utterly destroyed the unit of specialist investigators and facilitated the complete capture of SARS under Tom Moyane. I know all the members of this investigation unit, and I can't tell you what had happened to their lives. Their lives were completely destroyed. Johan van Lochenberg, Peter Richer, Ivan Pillay, and all these guys, they are shadows of their former self. They have relationship problems, they have health problems, because they've been under assault for years. For what? For doing splendid work. So the Sunday Times has now apologized profusely, actually twice, a year apart, and the reporters will remain forever discredited. It was a terrible blot on journalism in South Africa. But other investigative journalists made up for it. And when I'm talking about investigative journalism and the great work that they did that makes me very proud. I don't want you to understand that I'm giving high marks to the state of our media in South Africa. I think it's poor. I think it's poor. I think Cape Town is served so badly, especially in English. It is appalling. It is appalling. When I was at Business Day, I was in the same group as the Cape Times, so I was more or less working for the Cape Times. My stories appeared there. And now I don't buy it anymore, but in the shop I walk past and I just look at it and it makes me sick to my stomach. But that's not only the problem here. I think it's across the board. It is shallow reporting by inexperienced people, far too few journalists, very little experience, young editors whose only job it is to make money for the owners. And then we had the new phenomenon, which is a dangerous one, that we never really had before, that we saw with Iqbal's survey and with the Guptas, where business people would buy a media house, not so much for any ideological reason, but to use that media house to suck up to the government so they can get tenders. And that is destructive to journalism. But enough of that. Let me talk about the good guys. In November 2009, the Mail and Guardian first reported that Jacob Zuma was building a fancy homestead with heliports and swimming pool, fire pool, and a private clinic at Nkandla. It reported that it was going to cost the taxpayer 65 million. Other reporters got onto it in the months after that and didn't let go, despite Zuma and the ANC's obfuscation, denials, and accusing reporters of racism. Our Minister of Transport, Bladen Zimande, leader of the Communist Party, addressed us in a press conference at that time and said, "You white reporters who write on Nkandla, you are racists because you don't want a president to have a proper home." Now look at Uncle Blade now. He is now squeaky clean, screaming against state capture. It turned out the Nkandla build was costing the taxpayer 250 million rand in the end. People were outraged, and I think that was the first sign of people saying, "Hey, what's going on here? We're not going to stand for this." In 2014, the then public protector, Thuli Madonsela, brought out a damning report stating Zuma had benefited unduly. Now, I don't need to sing Thuli Madonsela's praises to you. We all love her, because that was a brave, brave act to come and use the language that she used and say, this is not on. This is not on. She spoke. I mean, the whole speaking truth to power is something that journalists use glibly. Thuli Madonsela spoke truth to power. And she was vilified in Parliament, by the cabinet, by the president, by a lot of the media for it. And now, looking back, 2014, that report on Zuma and Nkandla, a bit of a turning point. So, yeah, in Parliament, Thuli Madonsela was called names by people who are now in the Ramaphosa camp. And yet, in the end, Zuma had to apologize to the nation and pay back some of the money. So some of us in the media started picking up rumors about the increasing influence of the three Gupta brothers around 2009, 2010. And that magnificent investigative outfit, Amabungane, wrote its first Gupta story in 2010. Senior ANC leaders, again including many now in the Ramaphosa camp ranting about state capture, reassured us that these were the good guys They were committed to assisting creating a developmental state, blah, blah, blah. And please don't be so xenophobic just because they're Indian. And then in April 2013, an alert radio reporter picked up that a chartered plane with guests for a Gupta wedding at Sun City had landed at the military base in Waterkloof. Using a military airport, a national key point nogal, for a private wedding was so unusual and so brazen, and the media ran with it and people got angry. Again, the top leaders of the ANC, including the so-called good guys now, tried to smooth it over and explain it away, again suggesting prejudice if we thought that that was a scandal. But the hunt for the truth about the Guptas was then on. Who were these people who appeared from nowhere? Their history in India was checkered. I mean, they were not big people, and suddenly they appeared in South Africa, and they are these big moguls. The puzzle was slowly beginning to form bit by teeny bit. We discovered that Zuma's children were working for the Guptas, and had suddenly become multimillionaires from earning like 12,000 rand a month to buying a Porsche and a Ferrari. We sniffed out the Sun City guest list and saw several ministers and senior ANC leaders on it. Some reporters started looking at which ANC people traveled to Dubai. Others started asking questions about the massive increase in the Gupta's wealth. Every few months, you could see that they have an extra billion. Where did that money come from? Yet others investigated the Zuma buddy appointed as head of SARS in 2014, Tom Moyane, the man who has destroyed one of the very best revenue collecting agencies in the world. And then came June 2017. And this is, to me, where different strands come together. Whistleblowers, in other words, concerned citizens, not part of any organization, not journalists, and civil society organizations and the media. Two Gupta company insiders decided that their loyalty to their country was more important than their jobs. We don't know their real identity. They identified themselves as Stan and John at the Zondo Commission. What followed was the brilliant stuff, the stuff that brilliant movies are made of. Stan and John had a friend who knew my old varsity mate, Brian Curran, old activist, UDF activist, human rights lawyer, and vouched for him, saying Brian can be trusted. And they, lots of cloak and dagger and lots of elaborate security measures. Stan and John eventually presented Brian Curran with a hard drive containing about 300,000 emails from the Gupta's main server. Brian had a certified copy made and took it overseas for safekeeping. He then contacted his old friend, one of the real stars of civil society activism, Mark Haywood, who again, employing elaborate safety measures, took another copy of this hard drive to the Daily Maverick and give it to its founder, Branko Brkic. So Branko tells me he looked at some of the emails and his eyes popped out and his heart was palpitating and he knew that this was the real deal. It was the biggest story of his life, the state capture smoking gun. But he also realized that his organization didn't have the resources to comb through it all and analyze all the messages. Because you've got to be right. You can't just take an email and publish the email with names in it. You've got to find out, is this correct? Is this the context? What's the real story of this email? 300,000 of them. So Branko took it to Amabungane, Stefans Brummer and Sam Sol, and suggested a joint operation, and later a team from News24.com under Adrian Vasson was also brought in. And together they raised funds to relocate and safeguard Tom Stan and John and their families outside the country, where they still are, and then meticulously started sifting through hundreds of thousands of messages. Brian joined Stan and John overseas and drew up sworn affidavits that could or could not be put before the Zondo Commission, depending on whether Stan and John would ever feel safe enough to return to South Africa to give evidence. I hope they do. The leaked emails turned out not only to be authentic, but to be an absolute game changer, even a history changer. The Guptas and several of those politicians and parastatal officials mentioned in the emails declared they were fake. You remember? These are fake emails. You made it up. But everybody, bit, after every new email, confirmed the previous one and clicked in with other events. Everybody knew that they were not. They were the real deal. The truth about the extent of the Gupta brothers' influence in government and the extraordinary hold they had over Jacob Zuma were much worse than most people, me included, expected. It was clear from some of the messages that the brothers had very little respect for Jacob Zuma and actually ordered him to do certain things or to hire or fire certain people, including cabinet ministers. We will soon, before the Zondo Commission, have a man who I now see he calls himself on Twitter Mr. Fearfokkel. When you start there, you know, I'm not going to take this guy very seriously. Fikile Mbalula. He's going to go before the Zondo Commission and explain why he was told by the Guptas that he was going to be the Minister of Sport days before the President told him that. I hope Stan and John will one day reveal their true identities so we could thank them for the service to the nation. They didn't do it for the money. In fact, they sacrificed much. They are true civil society activists. So their actions prove how crucially important whistleblowers are in a corrupt state like ours. Fortunately, Stan and John had people looking after them and whisked them away. Many other whistleblowers in local government and elsewhere were not so fortunate, and some paid with their lives. The protection whistleblowers in South Africa receive, according to the Protected Disclosures Act, is excellent on paper, but don't always realize in practice. The requirement, for instance, the requirement in the Act that whistleblowers must first exhaust internal channels in their organization before reporting it to the outside people or institutions, actively work against the Act's aim of reducing corruption and fraud. Many whistleblowers have found out that they are not protected inside their organizations or companies. We have to do much more to honor, celebrate, and protect the whistleblowers in our society. Whistleblowing is an act of patriotism and moral bravery, the first line of defense against corruption and abuse. But we do have Corruption Watch. Corruption Watch is an NGO that was launched in January 2012 at the initiative of COSATU. It provides a platform and protection for whistleblowers and has hotlines that guarantee anonymity. But Corruption Watch also does a lot of own research and mobilizes anti-corruption campaign, a crucial civil society organization. This joint operation by Daily Maverick and Amabungane and News 24 on the Gupta emails was a rare occurrence in the world of journalism. But an example has now been set. When journalists realize this is not about my scoop, this is about how important it is for the people of this country to get this information, then they will work together. I'm very, very proud of my colleagues at these media houses. They all deserve medals, and they have helped change our history. So right through this long process of releasing the Gupta emails, civil society organizations such as KSAC and Freedom Under Law, Helen Suzman and others kept up the pressure with litigation, something media organizations cannot afford to do. And even the DA and the EFF got in on the act of running to court. We have seen magnificent investigative journalism after the Gupta emails, heaping up the pressure. Sikonati Manchacha, Financial Mail on Eskom, remarkable journalism. Polly van Wyk on SARS, she has blown open the SARS story like I've never seen a story broken down like that before. Pieter Louis Meiberg on Prasa and Transnet, the guy who came with the story of, hey, you bought these things at double the price, you gave 5 billion rand commission to the Guptas, and now they're too tall for our... And they all said, yeah, you're a little racist and a little Afrikaner, and we have not seen those trains on our rails, and we now know. The Guptas did get 5 billion rand just for introducing Prasa to the Chinese. 5 billion rand. When I talk about these things, I've learned to make very clear that I pronounce billion correctly, because we don't talk about millions anymore. When corruption here, if it's in the millions, we don't count. If it's in a billion, we take notice, and it's always in the billions. So sometimes this piecemeal reporting on corruption and state capture get lost on the public, and there's the need to pull it all together. And the new trend in the last few years is that some journalists have started publishing books to give a fuller perspective and to break new scandals. Pieter Louis Meiberg's book on the Guptas, Adrian Basson and Peter de Tooy's book on Zuma, Rob Rose's brilliant book on the Steinhoff scandal, and many others. And then just before the ANC's crucial national conference at Nasrec in December 2017, my old partner in crime of Vrye Weekblad days, Jacques Pau, published his bombshell book, The President's Keepers, with new dirt on Zuma and others. The book broke all South African sales records, apart from the Bible. Every time Jacques brags about his book sales, I said, the Bible still sells more. I think it helped Jacques a lot that the intelligence services threatened to sue him and actually raided his premises in Riebeek-Kasteel. The book contained smoking guns on virtually every second page, proving how fundamentally corrupt the Zuma regime and its partners in business were. And then we had another book by an old civil society activist, Dr. Chippy Olver, who wrote this remarkable book called How to Steal a City, on how the ANC literally stole Port Elizabeth. It's a remarkable book. It was an act of bravery. Last year, investigative journalists exposed the massive corruption and theft at VBS Bank, leading to a full investigation and soon will lead to criminal prosecutions. Polly van Wyk of Daily Maverick's exposés of 2 top EFF leaders taking part in this so-called bank heist have potentially dented that party's chances to grow substantially in the coming election. The EFF was cheering the media on when it exposed the Guptas and the Zuma inner circle, but the moment it became the subject of investigations, the EFF turned on journalists with nasty insults, defamation, and threats of violence. Now we know. I am one of 5 journalists who are in the process of asking the courts to order the EFF to stop intimidating and threatening us, and the court case will be heard in the next few days. It just became too personal and too dangerous. I was at the Zondo Commission in Johannesburg and came out, and I was mobbed by an AFF crowd because they recognized me. And that's a slippery slope that we don't want to see. So they will have to respond in court and say, what is going on? So the theme of failing societies and failed states has become a popular one with academics in recent years all over the world. And one thing all researchers agree on is that stable, open societies never fail, not one on record. Stability and openness are South Africa's greatest assets. Without that, there is no prospect of economic growth. And South Africa, as you well know, you who have traveled, is one of the most open societies in the developing world, actually in the entire world. In many ways, South Africa is a more open society than the United States of America. It is a result of our history, our political leadership over the decades, and of our constitution. We have lived with this constitution now for more than 20 years. Civil society will have to guard this openness of our society with much energy and commitment. It is absolutely precious. But we do live in an era where narrow nationalism and cheap populism have infected much of the world and threaten openness and stability everywhere it manifests. We have witnessed the alarming growth of these phenomena in the ANC under Zuma and parties like the EFF. Populism and ethnic chauvinism thrive when people feel marginalized and neglected, and when inequality is as stark as it is in our country. Civil society's bigger challenge from 2019, if Cyril behaves, will be to fight against inequality and poverty and for more political accountability, for an efficient and clean civil service on all levels, whose task it is to improve the lives of those who were neglected by the governments since 1994. Civil society organizations will have to get their hands dirty and get involved in the many failing local governments across the country, where most people experience government, or the lack of it, most acutely. This is where you feel the state first, is in your neighborhood. The picture out there is absolutely appalling. Now, the uncomfortable truth is that the most effective civil society organization focusing on local government is a body called AfriForum. It fixes potholes, it fixes broken sewage works, it monitors water quality all over the country, it holds local councils accountable, often through litigation. And AfriForum, by the way, is one of the wealthiest NGOs in the world. They have more than 300,000 members, and each one of them pay at least 50 Rand membership every month. Do the maths. The sad reality is that AfriForum is a right-wing Afrikaner nationalist movement that plays a very dangerous role in ethnic mobilization of white people and contributes to the polarization of our society. It uses its white privilege to maintain its privilege, and it invokes a fake of white victimhood instead of helping the conservative Afrikaner community to fully integrate into society. In my view, AfriForum is a dangerous organization that needs to be countered aggressively, and I do so in my writing often. Which quickly brings me to the faith communities. In any nation, an important part of civil society. I was struck when the DRC had its elections 2 weeks ago, that the Catholic Church deployed 40,000 observers to observe the elections. And it made me wonder once again why the South African faith communities have become so passive, so uninvolved in public life. Of course, with one or two exceptions that you can immediately shout out. Faith communities are in the ideal position to be active on the ground, to fight for justice and for caring government. Where, for instance, were the predominantly Afrikaans churches when racial violence exploded in a town like Colini in Northwest, and when racism at formerly white schools stirs up emotions, as we see in Schweizer right now? I want to ask them, what would your Jesus have done? Would he not have gotten involved to bring peace and bring people together? Let me not stray too far on the religious front. Civil society's struggle for justice and truth and clean and responsive government is far from over. There are many secrets of the Zuma circle still to be exposed. There's a lot of money to be getting back from elsewhere. President Cyril Ramaphosa is smiling at journalists and civil society activists because he reckons my enemy's enemy is my friend. But we will have to be very vigilant. Cyril Ramaphosa is probably the best chance we have at a rebuild post-Zuma, but he is still a politician leading a party that is harboring many charlatans and secrets. Thank you. We've got a couple of minutes for questions, if there are any.